Backstory: Chris and Julia were siblings, though their personalities were far from similar. Chris, the younger of the two, was a college student who loved reading detective and mystery novels. His sharp mind and curiosity often led him into unexpected situations. Julia, the older sister, had recently graduated from university and, upon returning home, was trying to find her place in life. She was more pragmatic than her brother, but still had a sense of adventure. They both lived in a small town in Florida, where life was quiet and predictable. Their journey began with the idea of spending the weekend together, reminiscing about their childhood, and enjoying the summer days. They decided to visit their grandparents, who lived on the other side of the state, in an old farmhouse. This trip was meant to be a kind of reset for them, a break from the hustle and bustle of the city, work, and studies. They packed their old car's trunk with things, turned on their favorite playlist, and set off early in the morning. The trip started wonderfully. Chris and Julia chatted, laughed, and reminisced about family stories. They stopped at a small cafe by the roadside, where they ordered famous strawberry pies and coffee. The atmosphere of serenity and freedom filled the air as they ventured into the more deserted stretches of the road. On the empty road, the road they were driving on was long and winding, stretching far into the horizon. On both sides, it was surrounded by endless fields and forests. The sun was gradually setting, painting the sky in golden-orange hues. Julia, sitting behind the wheel, turned on the radio, but the signal was weak, and the music was constantly interrupted by static noise. Chris, studying the map, noticed that they would be passing through a less populated part of the state, but it didn't cause much concern. "We're almost there," Julia said, glancing quickly at her brother. "A couple more hours, and we'll be at Grandma and Grandpa's." "Great," Chris replied. "I hope they'll greet us with a warm dinner." The pie was tasty, but it was a little too small. They had been driving for several hours when they began to notice the thickening air and the absence of other cars, which started to create a strange sense of isolation. It felt like the road belonged only to them. The unnatural truck. The first thing that caught their attention was the sound. In the distance, a low engine roar could be heard, growing louder. Chris, looking out the window, spotted a strange vehicle ahead. It was an old, battered truck with a rusted body and a license plate that was unreadable due to the dirt. It seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, breaking their solitude. "What is that wreck?" Chris asked, surprised, nodding toward the approaching truck. "No idea," Julia replied, slightly tensing up. "Just stay away from it." However, the truck didn't seem to want to leave them alone. The vehicle began approaching at an unnatural speed, despite seeming heavy and clumsy. The truck got so close that Chris and Julia could feel the engine growling, and clouds of black smoke poured from the exhaust pipe. It was as if the truck were alive, with the sole purpose of catching up to them. "What does it want?" Chris asked anxiously, watching as Julia pressed the gas pedal. "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out," she replied sharply, trying to increase the distance. Despite their efforts, the truck continued its pursuit, as if playing with them. After a while, it suddenly swerved off the road, disappearing in a cloud of dust. The situation left them with a sense of unease, but Chris tried to lighten the mood with a joke. "Probably just some farmer with a bad mood," he smirked, though uncertainty tinged his voice. The beginning of the nightmare. They continued their journey, hoping not to encounter the mysterious truck again. But after a few miles, the road led them to an old church, standing off to the side of the highway. The building looked abandoned. The roof was crumbling, the windows boarded up, and pieces of paint were peeling from the facade. However, it wasn't the building itself that drew the most attention, but what was nearby. A few dozen meters from the church, Chris noticed a large pipe protruding from the ground. It looked like the ventilation shaft of an underground bunker. But the strangest thing was the figure of a person, barely moving near the pipe. The person was wearing a long cloak and a wide-brimmed hat that completely concealed their face. "What's he doing?" Julia whispered, stopping the car. They watched as the figure dragged something heavy toward the pipe. It resembled a human body wrapped in a dirty white cloth. The stranger approached the pipe, opened its lid, and dropped the bundle inside. Afterward, he froze, as if sensing that he was being watched. Chris and Julia huddled down in their seats, not daring to move. Their hearts were beating so loudly it felt like the stranger could hear them. After a few seconds, he jumped into the truck, the same one that had been chasing them earlier, and disappeared, leaving only tracks on the dusty road. Exploring the pipe, for several minutes, they sat in the car in complete silence, unsure of what to do next. Finally, Chris spoke up. "We can't just leave without knowing what he dropped in there. It might be someone alive." "Are you out of your mind?" Julia exclaimed. "We saw what he did. This is clearly not a place we should go near." But curiosity had already taken hold of Chris. He got out of the car and headed toward the pipe, despite his sister's protests. Julia followed him, not wanting to leave him alone. As they got closer, the smell of rot and dampness hit them, causing a wave of nausea. "My God, what is this place?" Julia whispered, covering her face with her hands. Chris examined the pipe. It was covered in rust, and the edges looked sharp and dangerous. Dark stains were visible on the walls, dripping down into the darkness. "I'm going down," he said firmly, grabbing a flashlight he had found in the car's trunk. "Are you serious?" Julia tried to stop him. "This is madness." But Chris had already knelt down at the edge of the pipe and began to descend, clinging to the rough edges and supports that looked barely reliable. The beam of the flashlight cut through the thick darkness, illuminating the walls marked with scratches and strange symbols. The smell grew stronger, and the air grew colder. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a large underground chamber. The walls were made of stone, covered in mold and dirt. On the floor were piles of belongings: clothes, shoes, old suitcases. All looked forgotten and covered in dust. But the most chilling thing was the sight of human bodies hanging on one of the walls, arranged like a grotesque mosaic. Chris froze, realizing the horror of what he was seeing. His breathing quickened, and he felt cold sweat dripping down his back. He shone the flashlight on one of the bodies and realized it was mummified, though its skin appeared strangely smooth, as though it had been treated. "Chris, are you there?" Julia's voice called from above, full of concern. "Don't come down," he shouted, trying to hold back the panic. "There's something terrible here." Chris felt his legs weaken, but he forced himself to continue his exploration. Along the wall, narrow corridors stretched, paved with the same stone tiles but decorated with even stranger symbols. They looked ancient, as if they belonged to a culture long vanished from the earth. In some places, the corridors widened, revealing rooms filled with items that seemed both modern and out of place. Rusty surgical tools, antique music boxes, and faded photographs. Chris picked up one item after another, feeling the fear intertwine with uncontrollable curiosity. But his investigation was interrupted by a sound, faint, yet distinct. It was a moan. It came from the far end of the corridor, causing him to freeze in place. His inner voice told him to turn back, but something kept him from doing so. "Julia, there's someone here," he yelled up. "I need to check." "No, Chris, come back. It's too dangerous." Her voice trembled with fear. Ignoring her warnings, Chris headed toward the source of the sound. The closer he got, the clearer the moans became. They sounded muffled, as if someone were trying to scream but couldn't due to weakness. The corridor ended in a small chamber where a single metal table stood. On it lay a figure wrapped in dirty cloth. Chris's heart stopped. He slowly approached the table, holding the flashlight so he could see everything around him. Carefully unwrapping the cloth, he discovered a man, middle-aged, with a gaunt face and deeply sunken eyes. His skin was pale, and his lips trembled, as if he were trying to say something. You need to leave," the man rasped weakly. "We'll return." Chris stepped back, trying to make sense of what was happening. At that moment, heavy footsteps echoed from somewhere in the distance. They were loud and growing nearer. Chris quickly grabbed the flashlight and ran back toward the pipe, desperately trying to suppress his fear. His heart pounded, and his breath quickened with panic. "Julia," he yelled, reaching the wall with the pipe. "Throw me the rope. I need to get out." Julia, seeing his face, understood that something terrible had happened. She quickly unrolled an old rope she had found in the trunk and threw it down. Chris, grabbing onto it, began to climb, hearing the footsteps growing louder. Just as he was almost out, a dark figure slid out of the corridor's shadow. It was too far to make out details, but its presence instilled primal terror. Chris scrambled out, gasping for air, and collapsed onto the ground beside the car. "Start the car! Start the car!" he yelled at Julia, struggling to get to his feet. Julia rushed to the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off, leaving the pipe and the church behind. Chris sat in the passenger seat, breathing heavily, trying to explain what he had seen, but the words wouldn't come. The only thing he managed to say was, "We need to warn someone about that place." But deep down, he knew the evil that resided there wouldn't be contained in one place. Truck chase. It seemed that the fear left by the pipe and the underground nightmare was gradually fading as they sped down the road. Chris remained silent, staring out the window, his face pale, and his hands still slightly trembling. Julia gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the knuckles on her fingers turned white. She didn't ask questions, knowing that her brother needed time to recover. Their car raced down the road, as if they were trying to escape not only from the truck but from the terror itself that was chasing them. But after a few miles, they heard a familiar sound, the roar of an engine suddenly breaking the silence. The sound was as ominous as the first time. Chris tensed and looked out the window. Behind them, barely visible in the dusty haze, the truck appeared. Its dirty body, looking like a relic from another era, was relentlessly closing in. "It's here again!" Chris screamed, grabbing the seat. "Damn it, Julia! Step on it! I'm already at full speed," she replied, quickly glancing at the rearview mirror. Her face tensed, and her eyes flickered from the road to the truck, which was closing the distance. The truck moved as though the laws of physics didn't apply to it. It easily navigated the curves and bumps in the road, as if it were more than just a machine. It let out a low, menacing growl, and thick black smoke poured from the exhaust, obscuring their view behind. "What does it want from us?" Julia screamed in panic, pressing the gas pedal to the floor. "It can't have normal motives," Chris replied grimly. "Did you see what it did near the pipe? That thing, or whatever it is hunting us." The truck suddenly accelerated, sticking so close to the rear bumper of their car that Chris could feel the shiver run down his spine just from looking at its broken and terrifying front. Then there was a crash. The car jerked forward as the truck rammed them from behind. "It's trying to push us off the road," Chris screamed, gripping the dashboard. "Hold on tight." Julia yanked the wheel, desperately trying to keep the car on the road. The headlights of the truck blazed through their rearview mirror, and its horn blared loudly as if signaling the inevitable end. It hit them again, harder this time. Julia's car swerved, nearly going off the edge. "We can't keep this up," Chris shouted, his voice trembling with fear. Julia looked ahead. There was a fork in the road just a few hundred meters away. She made a snap decision. "Hold on, we're turning." The truck hit them again, but at that moment, Julia sharply turned the wheel left, and their car veered onto a narrow dirt road leading into a dense forest. The truck seemed to lose control for a second but soon followed, its wheels leaving deep tracks in the mud. The dirt road was bumpy, with deep potholes and turns that could trap them. However, the thick trees around them limited their maneuvering space and made it feel as though the forest was watching them with silent reproach. "We need to lose it, or it'll crush us," Chris screamed, frantically looking back. "How? It's too fast," Julia replied, struggling to control the car, which was beginning to lose traction on the wet ground. And then Chris noticed something ahead. "There's a bridge. It crosses over a river. If we get to the other side, it might fall behind." "That's too risky," Julia shouted, but there was no other choice. They sped onto the narrow bridge, which creaked loudly under the weight of their car. The boards under the wheels groaned and buckled, and for a moment, Chris thought the bridge wouldn't hold. But they made it across. The truck, however, didn't seem to care about the bridge's condition. It also started crossing, and the loud crack of braking wood could be heard over the roar of its engine. As soon as their car crossed the bridge, Julia sharply swerved to the side, nearly crashing into a tree. She stopped to catch her breath. Chris looked back and breathed a sigh of relief as he saw the bridge begin to collapse under the truck's weight. Soon, a loud crack echoed, and the truck fell into the water with the wreckage. They sat in silence, breathing heavily, as the river swallowed the remains of the bridge. But even that didn't bring complete relief. Deep down, they knew that the evil that had been chasing them might not be done with them yet. The creature from the water. Julia and Chris sat in the car, breathing heavily, watching the wreckage of the bridge and the truck disappear into the murky water. The sun had long set, and the thick twilight of the forest surrounded them. For the first time in a long while, they felt relief, though it was fragile. "That was madness," Julia mumbled, wiping sweat from her face with her hand. "I don't know how we even made it out." Chris, sitting with his eyes closed, still couldn't calm down. He kept replaying every moment of that terror in his mind, trying to convince himself that it was finally over. "Do you think? Is it over?" he asked quietly, almost afraid that even these words might summon a new nightmare. "I don't know," Julia answered, staring into the dark forest through the windshield. "But I know one thing. We need to get out of here as fast as possible." Chris was about to nod when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. His gaze turned to the river, and something inside him tightened. "Julia," he started, his voice shaking. "Do you see that?" She turned her head and froze too. Something was emerging from the water. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall and oddly curved. But as the figure drew closer, it became clear. It wasn't human. It was a creature, draped in a long wet cloak that clung to its body. A wide-brimmed hat obscured most of its face, but wet strands of strange hair, or perhaps something else, hung from underneath. It moved slowly but surely, as though it knew its prey was still here. "This is impossible," Julia whispered, her hands gripping the wheel again. "It couldn't have survived." "But it did survive," Chris shouted, grabbing her hand. "Start the car. Now!" The creature got closer, and now they could make out more details. Its skin was unnaturally pale, as if covered by a mummified layer, and its eyes, gleaming in the headlights, looked like empty, endless holes. Suddenly, it stopped, staring right at them. Then it lunged forward. "Drive, Julia!" Chris was already shouting, shaking his sister. "It's coming!" Julia turned the engine on, which thankfully roared to life, and slammed her foot on the gas. The car shot forward, gaining speed. But the creature didn't lag behind. It ran after them with inhuman speed. Chris screamed as he saw it leap directly onto the hood. "Shake it off," he yelled. Julia swerved the wheel hard right, the car spinning, and the creature was thrown onto the ground. She didn't give it time to get up. The car roared forward, and Julia ran it over, feeling the wheels roll over its body. Chris gasped loudly, and Julia bit her lip, trying not to cry. But even after running it over, they didn't feel safe. The creature moved. In the rearview mirror, Chris saw it rise, as though it hadn't even felt the impact. This is impossible," he gasped. Julia turned the car around and charged straight at it again. The tires screeched as she floored the gas pedal. This time, the hit was strong. The car practically threw the creature aside. Its body flew several meters, crashed into a tree, and lay still. "Do you think it's really dead now?" Julia whispered, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know, but I'm not checking," Chris replied, still out of breath. Julia hit the gas and the car shot forward again. They sped down the forest road, not looking back. Every turn and bump they encountered was a struggle to keep control, but the fear driving them forward was stronger than anything. In search of help, they drove in complete silence for several minutes. Chris anxiously stared into the darkness outside the windows, while Julia kept her focus ahead. Their car slid across the wet mud, but they didn't stop. "We need to find help," Julia finally spoke, her voice trembling. "The police? Anyone? There should be a gas station or a station in the next town," Chris replied, looking at the map, which seemed almost useless in the chaos. After several more miles, they finally saw a light. It was a small roadside gas station, surrounded by a few old lamps. For a moment, their hearts filled with hope. "There!" Chris shouted, pointing at the building. They stopped in front of the entrance. Julia quickly turned off the engine, and both of them rushed out of the car, looking around. The gas station looked old and abandoned, but the light inside the building was on. "Hey, is anyone here?" Chris shouted, pounding on the glass door. But instead of an answer, they heard a strange sound behind them. It was a familiar, low growl, the same sound they never wanted to hear again. The fight at the gas station. Chris and Julia froze when a strange rustling sound came from behind. Chris turned around, and his heart stopped. From the darkness, something was approaching them. It moved quickly and confidently, its silhouette even more terrifying in the moonlight. It was the same creature they had seen before. Its long limbs twisted unnaturally, and its eyes, like empty pits, seemed to look right into their souls. "Julia, run!" Chris screamed. Grabbing her hand, they ran toward the gas station door, but just as Julia grabbed the handle, they realized it was locked. Chris began banging on the glass with all his strength, shouting, "Open up! Please, help us!" But inside, there was no one. The creature stopped a few meters away from them, as if savoring their fear. It tilted its head to the side and emitted a low, eerie sound, almost like a wheezing laugh. "We need to come up with something else," Julia gasped, trying to stay calm. Chris looked around and noticed a metal barrel of gasoline near the entrance. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and shouted, "Julia, find something to make it explode." Julia ran to the corner of the building, where old rags were scattered on the ground. She picked one up, and a flash of hope flickered in her eyes. "Here, We can make a torch. Chris quickly shoved the rag into the barrel's opening and, with trembling hands, took out a lighter from his pocket. When the rag ignited, they rolled the barrel closer to the road. Meanwhile, the creature, almost playfully, took a few steps forward, stopping as if enjoying their desperate attempts to escape. "Now, light it!" Chris shouted. Julia lit the rag, and flames quickly engulfed the barrel. Chris and Julia jumped to the side. The creature froze for a moment, then swiftly moved toward them. A huge explosion illuminated the night as the barrel ignited, sending tongues of flame upward. The fiery flashes lit the area, but the creature still stood there. It looked battered, its cloak burned, revealing parts of its strange, unnatural body, but it didn't stop. "We did it!" Julia screamed, grabbing Chris's hand. "Run, before it catches us." But their joy was short-lived. The creature seemed to have not even slowed down. It continued after them, now faster. Chris grabbed Julia's hand, and they ran into the forest. In the forest was dense and grim, the trees merging into black walls, and dry branches clawed at their clothes. Chris and Julia made their way through the bushes, trying to hide. Behind them, they could hear the sound of heavy footsteps. The creature was still chasing them. "We can't keep going like this," Julia panted, stopping to catch her breath. "It's too fast for us." "No, we have to," Chris replied, his voice filled with panic. "If we stop, it'll find us." Suddenly, they heard a loud crack of branches nearby. Both froze, holding their breath. Chris looked around and noticed a fallen tree lying across the path. "We need to hide," he whispered, pointing to the tree. They crawled under its massive, moss-covered trunk and crouched low, trying not to move. The steps drew closer. The creature seemed to sense them. Its breath was heavy and deep, like an animal's. Chris saw the moonlight illuminate the creature for a brief moment. It moved slowly, as if sniffing the air. Its long arms brushed against the trees, and its head jerked from side to side. When the creature moved a bit farther away, Julia whispered, "We need to go, before it finds us." Chris nodded, and they began moving cautiously deeper into the forest. In the distance, they saw an old shed. The door was slightly ajar, and moonlight filtered through, illuminating the dusty floor and old furniture inside. Without a second thought, Chris and Julia made for the shed. They entered quietly, gently closing the door behind them. Inside, it looked abandoned. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust and straw. Cobwebs hung on the walls, and broken tools lay scattered in the corners. The air was heavy and stale, but it was better than the darkness of the forest and the creature hunting them. Chris was breathing heavily, his chest heaving from the stress. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. "This is it, Julia," he rasped. "It'll find us. We can't escape." Julia knelt beside him and put her arm around his shoulders. "Hey, we'll make it," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "Do you hear me? We'll get out of this. Just calm down, okay?" Chris looked up at her, his eyes full of fear and despair. "It's not just chasing us, Julia," he said quietly. "It's hunting us. There's a game for it. Then we'll break its game," Julia replied, her voice shaking, but her resolve firm. They fell silent, straining to listen to any sounds from outside. Only the wind rustled through the trees, making them creak. Time seemed to stand still. Chris stood up and looked around the shed. "We need to find something to defend ourselves with," he suggested. Julia nodded, and they began to search the room. Among the old junk, they found a pair of broken pitchforks, a rusty axe, and several long wooden boards. "This is better than nothing," Julia muttered, grabbing the axe. Suddenly, the air grew oppressive. Chris froze, catching an almost imperceptible sound behind the door. Quiet footsteps. Julia heard it too. They exchanged a glance, holding their breath. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the shed. Then everything went silent. A dead silence. "It's here," Julia whispered, gripping the axe. The door suddenly creaked open, and the creature stepped inside. The moonlight illuminated its terrifying figure. Its skin glistened with moisture, and thick liquid dripped from its mouth. Its eyes, burning with darkness, fixed directly on them. "Run!" Chris screamed. Grabbing Julia's hand, they dashed to the opposite end of the shed, climbing over piles of old junk. The creature let out a low roar and charged after them. The shed filled with the sound of breaking boards, clattering tools, and their heavy breathing. The ominous roar echoed through the shed. Chris looked around in panic, trying to find an exit, but all paths were blocked by debris. Julia gripped the axe, her hands trembling, but her eyes burned with determination. "Chris, stay behind me," she whispered, glancing from her brother to the approaching monster. "What are you going to do?" Chris asked, horrified. "Stay behind, and when there's a chance, run." The creature lunged forward, its massive hands reaching for them. Julia screamed and swung the axe. The blade cut through the air and landed directly in the monster's shoulder. There was a dull thud, and the creature staggered back, letting out a piercing scream that sent chills through them. "Don't stop!" Chris yelled. Seeing the creature faltered, Julia struck again, aiming for the creature's legs. The blade sank into its flesh, and the creature, wobbling, collapsed to one knee. This gave them a chance. "Run!" Julia screamed. Pulling Chris's hand, they ran through the debris, stumbling over old boards and tools. Julia spotted another door on the opposite side of the shed. It was half-blocked, but wide enough to slip through. Chris reached the door first and began clearing the way, tossing boards and debris aside. The creature, despite its injuries, was already rising. It snarled viciously, its eyes burning with darkness, and its body swayed slightly. "Julia, hurry!" Chris shouted, pushing at the door. Julia rushed to him, but the creature, letting out a furious scream, lunged again. She turned and at the last moment threw the axe straight into its chest. The weapon hit its mark, knocking the creature back several steps. That moment nearly cost them their lives. Chris flung open the door, and they bolted outside. The cold night air burned their faces. They ran, not looking back, hearing the creature tearing out of the shed, smashing everything in its path. The forest swallowed them again, but this time, Julia felt a flicker of hope. The axe had delayed the monster. Even if only for a moment, it was enough to give them a chance to survive. Chris and Julia raced through the forest, barely seeing the path ahead. Their breath came in short gasps, and their hearts pounded so hard they thought they might burst. Branches tore at their clothes, ripping fabric and leaving deep scratches on their skin. Chris tripped, crashing into tree roots, but Julia immediately grabbed his hand and helped him up. "We can't stop," she yelled, still running despite the pain in her legs. The forest around them was dark and endless. Every shadow, every rustle made them look over their shoulders, fearing to see the creature. They heard something loud cracking behind them. The creature was still chasing them. Chris, stumbling, looked at his sister. "We can't keep this up. It'll catch us. We have to." Julia refused to slow down. "Just keep running." After another burst of speed, the trees ahead began to thin out. The darkness of the forest gave way to moonlight spilling onto an old, overgrown road. Chris and Julia stumbled onto the open ground, their feet slipping on the wet soil, but they stayed upright and kept moving forward. In the distance, they saw a faint light. It was a flickering bulb at the entrance of a small house. It looked old, leaning, but in that moment, it became their symbol of hope. "Look, a house!" Chris shouted, pointing ahead. "Run to it! Faster!" Julia replied, feeling her strength waning. They raced toward the house, barely seeing the road underfoot. The light of the bulb grew closer, but behind them, the sounds continued. The crackling of branches, the crunching of dry earth under heavy steps. The creature was still on their tail. Chris and Julia reached the old house, their faces slick with sweat, their breath ragged, and their legs shaking with exhaustion. Chris reached the door first and pushed hard, but it wouldn't budge. "Damn it! It's locked!" he yelled, looking back at his sister. Julia rushed to the door and began knocking, at first gently, but soon her panic took over. Her fist pounded against the old wood, the sound echoing in the silent night. "Is anyone there? Please open," she begged, not stopping for a second. Chris also began to bang on the door, then checked the windows, but they were all tightly shut. "This is useless. There's no one here," he said desperately, but Julia refused to give up. "We can't just leave. It'll catch us." Somewhere in the forest, they heard the crack of branches. The creature's footsteps grew louder. It was getting closer. Chris turned and looked in the direction they'd come from. Among the trees, he saw a dark, moving figure. "It's here!" he shouted, grabbing Julia by the shoulder. "Wait!" she responded, pounding on the door with all her might. "Someone, please open." Suddenly, quiet footsteps could be heard from inside. Chris and Julia froze, exchanging fearful glances. Then came a dull sound, as if someone was moving a heavy bolt. The door creaked open just enough to reveal half of an old man's face. His eyes were tired and distrustful, and he held a rifle aimed directly at them. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked sharply. "Please, let us in," Julia cried, not caring about the weapon. "Something's chasing us. It will kill us." The man squinted, looking over their shoulders. Then he cursed under his breath, opened the door wider, and gestured for them to come inside. "Get in quickly." The door swung open, and before them stood an old man with a thick gray beard. His eyes were cold, the gaze of someone who had seen too much. Chris and Julia stumbled into the house, and the man slammed the door behind them. The creature's roar echoed from outside. The encounter with the ancient evil. Chris's voice was shaking as he gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror. "It's hunting us. Help us!" he cried, his hands gripping Julia's arm in panic. The old man simply shook his head, his face set in grim determination. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered in a low voice. "What is it? What's hunting us?" Julia managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The man turned, his gaze distant as he stroked his long gray beard. He sat on a creaky chair, the wood groaning under his weight. "It's an ancient evil," he began, his voice low and heavy with years of sorrow. "It's called the Ravager. It appears every 23 years, hunting for 23 days. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. The old man's eyes grew darker, the weight of the years pressing down on him. "Flesh, fear, souls." His words were like a curse. "It chooses its victims, but what's worse, those victims aren't random. It chooses those who have what it needs." Julia felt her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "It smells what makes you unique," the old man said slowly. Fear, passion, even your sins. This creature isn't just a hunter. It feeds on the very darkness. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable growl of something massive. It's here, Chris whispered, shrinking back behind Julia. The old man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and confident. He grabbed a rifle from a nearby wall, checking the ammunition. You're not the first ones to come here, he said, his voice cold with years of regret. I've seen people like you before, many years ago, but back then, I was younger. I couldn't save them. Julia froze. You've met it before? She asked, her voice quivering. The man nodded, his face hardening. It killed my wife. I've spent all these years preparing, studying it. I've learned its weaknesses, but no weapon can truly kill it. It's something more than flesh. Julia swallowed hard. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice desperate. We fight, the old man said simply. It's all we can do now. Outside, another loud crash shook the house. The door shuddered under the impact, and a monstrous roar split the night air, chilling them to the bone. It senses your fear, the old man murmured, his voice steady despite the growing danger. Stay calm. It's your only chance. Will we survive? Chris whispered, his voice filled with dread. The old man looked at him, his eyes filled with pain and resolved. I don't know, but if I die, I'll take it to hell with me. The door groaned once more under the monster's force. The creature was almost inside. Julia and Chris huddled together in fear, but the old man didn't flinch. He stood tall like a final line of defense, the confrontation with the ancient evil. The door held for a few more moments, but on the third blow, it splintered, and monstrous claws ripped through the wood, tearing it apart. The old man wasted no time. He fired his rifle at the creature, and it recoiled, letting go of the door. It will slow it down, but not for long, he yelled, reloading. You have 10 seconds to hide. Hide! Julia cried, her mind racing. You said it'll find us anyway. It will, the old man said grimly, glancing at the door. But I'll buy you time. He pointed to a hatch in the corner of the room. The basement, the safer, for a while. Julia grabbed Chris's hand and pulled him toward the hatch, but he hesitated. We can't leave you, he cried, his eyes wide with terror. The old man smiled faintly. Boy, I've been dead for years. My time was up 23 years ago. But now, at least I have a chance to get some revenge. He waved his hand sharply. Go! The creature struck the door again, and this time, it splintered completely, scattering in all directions. The creature stepped through, its monstrous form filling the doorway. Its skin was dark and armor-like, and its wings stretched high, casting a long shadow. Its red eyes locked onto the old man. Remember what I said, he shouted. Julia grabbed Chris's hand, and they both dove into the darkness of the basement. In the basement, the air was damp, thick with the smell of decay. A faint light from an oil lamp illuminated the walls, which were lined with old newspapers and faded photographs. The basement was cluttered with weapons, maps, and journals. Julia quickly closed the hatch behind them, propping it up with a nearby crate. What now? Chris asked, his breath heavy. She scanned the room, her eyes falling on a map covered in markings. At the center, there was a large red mark. It seemed to indicate their current location. He studied all of this, Julia muttered, lifting an old journal. Everything connects to the creature. The pages of the journal were filled with sketches of the monster. Its claws, wings, teeth. Among the notes was one that stood out. It can't be burned. can't be killed, but it can be wounded. Its weakness is its eyes and heart. Eyes and heart, Julia whispered. That's our only chance. The old man's final stand. Above them, the sounds of a violent struggle filled the house. The crash of furniture, followed by the old man's shout and gunshots, echoed in the basement. The creature roared in pain, but it didn't retreat. Chris looked at his sister. His face paled. We can't just stay here. He'll die. If we go up there, we all die, Julia replied, her voice tight. But I know. He's buying us time. Time that we need. Suddenly, there was a loud crash above them, followed by an eerie silence. Do you think he? Chris began, but he froze when he heard a faint creak. The hatch trembled. The creature had found them. It knows where we are, Julia said, her voice breaking. It's coming. Faster. We need weapons, she shouted, grabbing an old crowbar. Chris found an axe. The hatch flew off its hinges, and the monster dropped down into the basement. Julia didn't hesitate. She lunged at it, aiming the crowbar at its face. The creature caught it in one massive hand, but Julia kicked its knee, trying to destabilize it. Chris screamed and swung the axe at the creature's back, but it barely seemed to notice. It turned, grabbing him by the arm and throwing him into the wall. Chris! Julia screamed, but she didn't stop. She grabbed the oil lamp and hurled it at the monster. Flames engulfed it, and for a moment, it froze, howling in agony. Now! Julia shouted. Chris scrambled to his feet and, with a scream, struck the creature's burning eyes with the axe. It shrieked, staggering back. Heart! We need to hit the heart! Julia cried, grabbing the crowbar again. She ran forward and slammed it into the creature's chest. The weapon sank deep, puncturing the ribs and hitting the heart. For a moment, the creature went still, its body contorting unnaturally. But then it stirred again. No, it's not enough, Julia whispered in despair. A choice without choice. They realized, with growing horror, that the creature wouldn't die. It was merely delayed. Julia, the basement. We can lock it in here, Chris shouted. They rushed up the stairs, dragging a heavy chain behind them. The creature charged after them, but they managed to slam the hatch shut, blocking it from inside. How long will this hold? Julia whispered. Chris glanced at the burning house. We just have to survive a little longer. The smoke filled the house, and they rushed outside, hearing the building crackle and burn behind them. But Julia knew one thing. They hadn't killed it. They had only bought themselves time. Returned to the car. Julia and Chris ran along the deserted road, leaving the burning house behind. The night seemed endless, the silence muffling every step they took, but the fear wouldn't let go. Both knew the creature was still alive. We have to get back to the car, Julia said, breathing heavily. It's our only chance to get out of here. What if it follows us? Chris asked, struggling to catch his breath. Then it's better to meet it on the road than in this forest, she replied, gripping a rusty crowbar. The road seemed to stretch on forever. Every rustle in the bushes made them flinch, but the monster didn't appear. Finally, they saw their car parked by the side of the road, twisted branches still lying on the roof. The doors were open, and Chris immediately noticed that the hood was slightly lifted. Someone's been here, he said, nodding toward the hood. Or something, Julia replied quietly. Walking around the car, they carefully looked inside. The items were in their place, but claw marks were visible on the doors. Looks like it tried to get to us even here, Chris said, inspecting the long scratches on the body. It doesn't matter. The main thing is that the car starts, Julia said, sitting behind the wheel. Chris sat beside her, glancing over his shoulder as she inserted the key into the ignition. Unexpected problem. The engine groaned but didn't start. No, not now. Julia mumbled in panic, turning the key again. The engine sputtered but still didn't start. Damn! She screamed, slamming her fist on the wheel. It broke the engine. Chris wasted no time, jumped out of the car, and opened the hood. What are you doing? Julia shouted. I'm going to try to fix something, he replied. But when he lifted the hood, he froze. Inside, everything was covered in a black sludge that looked like tar. The liquid was dripping down the wires and covering the engine. It did this, he whispered, stepping back. Chris, run! Julia suddenly screamed. He turned and saw the creature slowly emerging from the forest. It was limping, one of its arms dangling limply, and its eyes glowed brighter than before. The race for survival. They ran down the road, leaving the car behind. Despite its wounds, the creature moved faster than they expected. Its steps echoed closer. We can't just run, Chris shouted, looking back. We need to find something, somewhere to hide, or a weapon, Julia replied, glancing over her shoulder. In the distance, lights appeared, faint headlights. A car! Someone's coming, she shouted, grabbing Chris by the arm. They ran toward the light, waving their arms and shouting, Help! Please stop! Meeting the stranger, an old pickup truck screeched to a halt. A man in a hat stepped out, holding a flashlight. What's going on here? He asked, looking at the two frightened fugitives. It's after us, Julia screamed, pointing into the darkness. The man shined the flashlight toward the forest and froze. The creature's red eyes glowed in the beam of light. Damn, you brought it here, he muttered, quickly heading back to the truck. Get in if you want to live, he shouted, starting the engine. Without thinking, Julia and Chris jumped into the bed of the truck, and it sped off. The pursuing horror. The creature didn't fall behind. It jumped onto the road and, spreading its wings, began chasing the pickup truck. Faster! It's right behind us, Chris yelled, gripping the side of the truck bed. I'm going as fast as I can, the driver shouted. The creature soared into the air and began descending toward the truck. Julia grabbed a metal crowbar she had found in the truck bed. When it gets close, I'll try to hit it, she shouted. The creature flew closer, its clawed hand reaching toward the truck. Julia struck its hand with all her might, forcing it to recoil. It's not giving up, Chris shouted, throwing the tool he had found at it. The driver sharply veered onto a side road, causing the creature to lose its balance. It slammed into the ground and screamed in fury. Did we lose it? Julia asked, struggling to catch her breath. Maybe, but not for long, the driver replied grimly. That thing always comes back. Meeting the stranger. When the pickup finally stopped on the side of the road near an old gas station, the driver turned off the engine and faced Julia and Chris. His face was covered in dust, and his eyes showed the weariness of someone who had seen too much. Who are you? Julia asked first, still gripping the crowbar as though it could protect them. Name's Roy, the man answered, tipping his hat. You're not the first ones to encounter that monster. Do you know what it is? Chris asked, trembling from the tension. Roy sighed and leaned against the truck hood. Yeah, I know. I lost my sister to it. 23 years ago. Roy's story. My sister, Lizzie, and I were just heading home from college back then. Roy began, looking into the darkness as if reliving the nightmare. I was driving, and everything was quiet, and then it appeared. Roy rubbed his face, as if trying to erase the painful memories. It targeted us just like it's after you now. Back then, I didn't know what it was. We thought we could run, hide, but that thing didn't stop. It took Lizzie right before my eyes. And you survived? Julia whispered, unable to believe her ears. Only because it already got what it came for, Roy answered darkly. Lizzie was its target, and I've lived with the curse ever since. Knowing it exists and waiting for it to return. Why does it hunt? What does it want? Chris asked, unable to look away from Roy. Roy fell silent for a long moment, then pulled an old, weathered notebook from the truck cab. He opened it to a page with drawings. One showed the winged monster, the other strange symbols. It appears every 23 years to feed. Fear, flesh. It needs these to continue its existence. Roy's plan. So what do we do? Julia asked, feeling panic rise in her throat. Roy closed the notebook and looked at her. I've been waiting for this moment for 23 years. I've gathered information, looked for ways to stop it. I can't bring Lizzie back, but I can at least try to put an end to this once and for all. You want to kill it? Chris looked at Roy skeptically. Kill? Or at least trap it where it can never escape, Roy replied. Roy walked to the back of his truck and opened the trunk. Inside were tools, gas cans, several boxes of ammunition, and a couple of ancient books. I have something that might help, he said, pulling out an old rifle and a long metal rod wrapped in cloth. This is ancient weaponry created by people who knew how to fight creatures like it. And you want us to help? Julia asked. You're already involved, Roy said coldly. It won't leave you alone until it gets what it wants. Together, we have a better chance of surviving. Julia and Chris exchanged a glance. The decision was hard, but there was no other choice. What do we need to do? She finally asked. Roy nodded, seeing their resolve. First, we need to go back to where it hunts. We'll lure it into a trap and make it face its own fears. Everyone has a weakness, even this monster. Action plan. Roy unfolded a map that he had pulled from his notebook and spread it out on the truck's hood. It was marked with numerous notations, indicating the locations of previous encounters with the creature. Here, he pointed to a small dot in the center of the forest. An old well. They say it was used for rituals in the past. People believed this place could lock away evil. So what's the plan? We just lure it there? Chris asked, throwing a worried glance down the dark road. No, Roy shook his head. First, we weaken it. I have a few things that can help. He pulled a bag from the trunk, filled with strange items. Chains soaked in a black liquid, amulets, and several bottles containing an unidentifiable mixture. Is this it? Just amulets and chains? Julia asked distrustfully. These aren't just things, Roy replied coldly. These amulets are made with ancient formulas. They radiate energy the creature despises. And these chains, they've been treated with salt and holy water. If we can wrap them around it, it will slow the beast down. And if we can't? Chris asked quietly. Roy looked him in the eyes, unblinking. Then we die. On the brink of despair. The path to the old well was grim and tense. The forest surrounding them seemed endless, and every sound of the wind or the crunch of branches made them freeze. Roy led them confidently, but Julia and Chris felt the creature could appear at any moment. It senses our fear, Roy said as he walked ahead. The more afraid you are, the easier it is for it to find us. That's reassuring, Julia muttered, gripping the crowbar she hadn't let go of since leaving the house. Suddenly, a crackling sound came from the distance. Everyone stopped. It's here, Chris whispered, his voice trembling. No, it's just the wind, Julia tried to reassure him, though she was barely holding herself together. But Roy stayed silent. He listened, then made a hand gesture, move faster. The creature returns. When they reached the spot, the well was exactly as Roy had described. Old, surrounded by faded stones, with a gaping black hole in the center. An ominous feeling hung in the air, as if nature itself was avoiding the place. Here, it'll be vulnerable, Roy said, unwrapping the amulets and chains. This well is our last hope. Suddenly, a roar pierced the air, deafening them. The ground shook, and the trees around them swayed. It's here, Chris screamed. The creature shot out from the shadows, its wings tearing through the air, its eyes glowing like embers. It moved fast, despite its size. Roy was the first to fire. The bullets from his ancient rifle slammed into the beast, making it screech in agony. Julia grabbed one of the chains and ran toward the creature. "What are you doing?" Chris shouted, trying to catch up with her. "We need to slow it down," she yelled, wrapping the chain around a nearby tree. Roy continued shooting, while the creature, enraged and wounded, turned toward him. Julia and Chris seized the moment and threw the remaining chains at the monster. The creature roared, its movements slowing, but no less terrifying. "Now to the well," Roy shouted, grabbing a bottle of the incendiary mixture. The final battle. The creature howled, struggling against the chains that bound its movements. Its powerful wings flapped, stirring whirlwinds, and its eyes burned with hellish light. Julia and Chris gathered all their strength to keep it at the edge of the well. "Just a little more," Roy yelled, his hands shaking as he lit the bottle with a match. The creature suddenly lunged, tearing one of the chains loose. Julia was thrown back, slamming into a stone. "Julia!" Chris cried, abandoning everything to help her. But the creature abruptly shot out a clawed hand, grabbing his leg. "No!" Julia screamed, trying to rise, but her head was spinning, and her body wouldn't obey. Roy hurled the flaming bottle directly into the creature's face. The flash illuminated its monstrous face, and the creature shrieked, recoiling. But it didn't release Chris. "Chris, hang on!" Julia grabbed a chain fragment and lunged at the monster. The creature yanked Chris toward itself, its claws sinking deeper. The young man fought with all his might, but his face twisted in pain. "Julia, don't come closer," he screamed, pushing against the beast with his last strength. "No, I won't leave you," she cried, her voice breaking with terror. The creature lunged forward, and together with Chris, it began falling into the well. Julia rushed forward, her fingers grazing her brother's hand for a split second, but she couldn't hold on to him. "Chris!" Her scream tore through the silence of the night. Chris disappeared into the black abyss of the well, along with the creature. The sound of the fall echoed across the area. Then everything fell silent. Julia collapsed to her knees at the edge of the well, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. He's gone." Her voice was almost inaudible. Roy approached her, his face grim. The first light of dawn poured through the trees, casting soft rays on the ground. Julia still sat by the well's edge, staring into its ink-black void. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and an emptiness gnawed at her chest. Roy remained silent, his face stern, but his eyes betrayed a deep fatigue and sorrow. Suddenly, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper came from the depths of the well. "I will return." Julia jumped up, recoiling from the edge. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Roy nodded cautiously, peering into the well. "We need to make sure," he said. The old hunter lit a lantern and, attaching it to a long rope, began lowering it down. The light faintly reflected off the walls, revealing dampness and mold, but the bottom remained unseen. "There's nothing here," he said quietly. "But I heard it." Julia clutched Roy's sleeve, her eyes wide with panic. "I heard its voice." Roy stared into the well for a long moment before pulling the lantern back up. "If it was here, it's gone now." His voice faltered, and he lowered his gaze. "Along with your brother," they continued inspecting the well, peering into every corner, but found nothing. No sign of Chris, no trace of the creature. Not even signs of a struggle. It was as if everything that had happened was just a terrible nightmare. When they finally stepped away from the well, the forest returned to an eerie quiet. But Julia still felt its presence. The creature hadn't disappeared. It hadn't been defeated. "We can't just leave," she said, clenching her fists. Roy looked at her with a heavy gaze. "For now, this is all we can do." As they walked away from the well, the forest seemed ominously silent, as if holding its breath. But in their hearts, the whisper still echoed, burning like poison. "I will return,